Mark had never been to a place as cold as this. The snow on this alien planet wasn't soft or powdery. It was sharp and biting. Every step he took, the wind cut into his skin like icy needles. The wind howled through the empty buildings of the outpost, making eerie sounds as it slipped through cracks in the walls. He had been sent here by the Earth government for a special mission, one that he didn't entirely understand. There was some kind of peace agreement between humans and aliens, and this frozen world was part of that. His job was simple: check on the conditions here, see if the alien factions were still cooperating, and then return to Earth with his findings. But as he trudged through the snow, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Mark had expected to find a team of aliens ready to help him with his mission. But when he arrived at the outpost, it was empty. No friendly faces, no welcoming parties, just a cold, silent station in the middle of nowhere. As he made his way through the outpost, Mark finally found something, or rather, someone, that would explain the silence. Inside a small, cold cabin at the far end of the station, he found a woman. At first he thought she was a statue, sitting motionless in a chair. Her skin was a pale shade, almost glowing in the dim light of the room, and her long hair was dark and tangled, draped across her shoulders. But when he stepped closer, he noticed her eyes, sharp and alert even though her body seemed stiff and worn. She looked at him with a strange mix of anger and surprise. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice surprisingly strong, considering the cold that seemed to freeze the very air around them. "I'm Mark. I'm with the Earth delegation," he said, trying to sound calm, though his teeth were chattering from the cold. "I was sent here to check on things. I wasn't expecting you." The woman didn't respond immediately. She just studied him, her gaze intense and cold. Mark could see the weariness in her eyes, but there was something else there, something that told him she wasn't just another stranded survivor. She had the air of someone who had seen too much, someone with a past. "So, you're the human they sent to inspect this place?" she finally asked, her voice laced with bitterness. "You have no idea what it's like to be stuck here, exiled, forgotten, left to die in a place like this." Mark hesitated. He hadn't expected such hostility. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to make sure everything's—" She cut him off with a harsh laugh. "Make sure everything's fine, right? That's why they sent you here, to make sure everything's fine." Her eyes narrowed and she stood up abruptly, her movement stiff and slow. "Well, it's not fine. It hasn't been fine for years." Mark took a step back, unsure of what to say. He'd never encountered an alien like her. There was a fierceness in her that made him uncomfortable, but there was also something oddly familiar about it. Maybe it was her pride, her refusal to admit weakness. He recognized that. It was a trait he shared, even though he wasn't sure why she had it. Before he could respond, the wind outside howled again, louder than before. The temperature inside the cabin seemed to drop even further, as if the storm outside had followed him inside. The woman's eyes flickered toward the window, and Mark saw her shiver slightly. She seemed to be trying to hide it, but it was clear she was cold too. The wind was howling louder now, the storm outside intensifying by the minute. "I suppose you didn't bring anything to protect yourself from this storm, did you?" she asked, her tone sharp again. Typical human arrogance. "I didn't know the storm would be this bad," Mark said quickly. "I came prepared, but—" "You're not prepared for this," she interrupted. "No one is." Before he could protest, she grabbed a coat from a nearby shelf and threw it at him. "Put this on. You're going to freeze to death if you don't. I'm not saving you." Mark caught the coat but hesitated. He wasn't used to people giving orders like that. But there was something about her that made him obey. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, the way her presence seemed to command attention without even trying. "I don't need your help," he muttered. But he still put on the coat. It wasn't much, but it helped a little against the biting cold. The woman's eyes flickered with something between amusement and annoyance as she watched him. "You humans are so stubborn," she said, almost to herself. "You think you can survive on your own, but you can't. Not here." Mark opened his mouth to reply, but before he could say anything, A loud crash interrupted him. The door to the cabin slammed open, and a gust of freezing air rushed inside. The storm outside had reached its peak, and the temperature inside the cabin was dropping quickly. Mark's breath fogged in the air, and he could feel the chill seeping into his bones. He looked at the woman, Zara, he now realized, wondering what she was going to do. She had been exiled here for a reason, and she had been alone for so long. Yet, there was something in her that made him feel connected. Something that made him feel like maybe they were both stranded in this cold place, both needing someone to help them survive. Zara didn't seem to share that feeling. She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "You're not going to last long out here, and neither am I, so you better get in my bed, human, if you want to survive." Mark blinked, not sure if he had heard her correctly. "What?" "Don't make me say it." "Again," she snapped. "The storm is going to kill us both if we don't keep warm. And I'm not going to freeze to death with some stubborn human who thinks he's better off freezing alone." Mark hesitated, feeling an awkward knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure how to handle this situation. Zara was cold, tough, and clearly didn't trust him, but the harsh reality of the storm outside made him reconsider. "Fine," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes to survive." Zara didn't smile, but there was something in her eyes, a brief flicker of approval maybe. "Good," she said. "Now get in the bed, and don't say anything." Mark walked over to the bed, his body aching from the cold. But before he could settle in, Zara stood up and walked toward him, her voice low and commanding. "Just so you know, human," she said, "this isn't about anything personal. It's about survival. Don't get any ideas." Mark nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As he climbed into the bed beside Zara, he could feel the heat radiating from her. The warmth was a relief, but it also made him painfully aware of how cold the rest of the cabin had become. Zara turned her back to him, her posture tense as if she wanted to make it clear that there were lines that shouldn't be crossed. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this strange, uncomfortable situation was only the beginning of something far more complicated. And as the storm raged on outside, Mark couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for whatever would come next. The wind outside howled as the snowstorm raged. The cold crept through the walls of the cabin, despite the fire Zara had started in the small stove. Mark lay in the bed, his body pressed against Zara's for warmth, but he kept his distance, not daring to make any unnecessary movement. The warmth from the bed was comforting, yet there was an awkward tension in the air. Zara lay with her back to him, her arms tightly folded across her chest. For the first few hours, neither of them spoke. Mark could feel the pressure of the silence, thick and heavy, but he didn't know what to say. Zara was still a mystery, an exiled alien woman with no apparent desire for his company, but one who had insisted he share her bed to survive. The temperature in the cabin continued to drop, but Mark could feel the heat from Zara's body. Her presence was as cold as the storm outside, but there was something about her, something strong and determined, that made him wonder who she really was. The way she carried herself, the way she spoke with authority, even when she was clearly struggling to keep herself alive. It was different from any human he'd known. Zara let out a deep breath, breaking the silence. "So what exactly are you doing here, human?" Her voice was sharp, but it wasn't unkind. She was still angry, but there was a note of curiosity in her tone, as if she wanted to understand why he had shown up on her doorstep. Mark hesitated before responding. "I told you, I'm here on a diplomatic mission. I was sent to check on the conditions here, make sure everything's running smoothly." Zara's laugh was dry and bitter. "Smoothly? You have no idea what's going on. Here, you humans think you can just come and go, check in and leave. You don't even understand what's happening on this planet." Mark frowned, not sure how to respond. "I don't understand what's happening here, no. But I'm not the one who made the rules. I'm just following orders." Zara turned over to face him, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You think I care about your orders? You don't know anything about this place, about why I'm here. You think you can just waltz in, tell me to behave, and then leave when it's convenient for you? Mark opened his mouth to respond, but something about her tone made him stop. There was pain in her voice, a deep well of hurt that she wasn't letting him see. He didn't understand it, but he could feel it. Her anger wasn't just directed at him. It went much deeper than that. I'm not here to upset you, Mark said softly. I don't know what happened, but I don't want to make things harder for you. Zara's expression softened slightly, though her eyes still held a certain distance. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the ceiling. You're just like the rest of them, she muttered, more to herself than to him. All you see is what's in FR. The storm outside had worsened. The snow whipped against the windows with a fury that felt almost alive, and the temperature inside the cabin was beginning to drop once again. Mark could feel the cold creeping back into his bones, no matter how much the fire crackled and popped in the stove. The warmth of the bed was comforting, but it wasn't enough to keep the chill of the outside world at bay for long. Zara had said little since their conversation earlier. She was still sitting near the stove, her back turned to him as she stared into the flames, seemingly lost in thought. Mark had tried to make small talk, but she wasn't interested in engaging. The tension between them was thick, and he could tell she was still struggling with something deep inside. Finally, after what felt like hours of silence, Zara stood up abruptly, startling Mark. She moved quickly toward the door, grabbing a thick blanket from a shelf near the wall. Where are you going? Mark asked, his voice breaking the silence. He didn't want to sound worried, but something in the air made him feel uneasy. Zara didn't answer immediately. She just looked at him with a piercing gaze, her eyes cold and calculating. You need to keep warm, she said flatly. I'm going to check the outside. We can't let the storm get any worse or we won't make it. Mark frowned, not sure if he should stop her. The storm was dangerous, and if Zara had been here for so long, she knew better than anyone how bad it could get. But the thought of her going out there alone in the freezing cold made him uneasy. You don't have to do this, Mark said, his voice softer than he intended. We can just stay inside, wait for it to pass. Zara turned to look at him, her face hard, her expression unreadable. You think I'm just going to sit here and wait for the storm to kill us? No. I've been through worse. I'm not going to let that happen. Mark couldn't argue with that. She had been exiled to this frozen world for a reason, and he had. No doubt that she was used to surviving in harsh conditions. Still, the idea of her going outside alone made him feel uneasy. He couldn't just sit back and let her face the storm by herself. I'll go with you, Mark said firmly, getting out of the bed and grabbing his coat. He couldn't let her face this alone. We'll go together. Zara seemed to consider this for a moment, her eyes scanning him as if weighing his words. Finally, she gave a small nod. Fine, but don't get in my way. Mark nodded, not trusting himself to say anything else. He knew better than to argue. Zara had been alone for so long, and it seemed like she wasn't used to depending on anyone else. But they were in this together now, whether she liked it or not. The wind howled louder as they opened the door, the cold air rushing in like a wall. Mark pulled his coat tighter around himself, trying to shield his face from the biting wind. Zara didn't seem to be bothered by the cold at all, her pace steady as she moved through the snow. The outpost was barely visible through the swirling snow, its once pristine buildings now barely standing against the power of the storm. Mark could barely see the path ahead of him, the snow blurring everything in front of him. He tried to keep his focus on Zara, but the wind made it difficult to hear anything. They moved quickly, Zara leading the way, her steps sure and confident, as she navigated the snow. Mark tried to keep up, but he could feel his strength waning. The cold was starting to take its toll, and the wind felt like it was tearing at him with every step. He couldn't remember the last time he had been this cold, and he couldn't imagine how Zara was handling it so easily. Zara turned back to look at him, her eyes sharp. Keep up, human, she snapped. I'm not here to babysit you. Mark gritted his teeth, pushing forward. I'm trying, but his legs were starting to feel like lead, and his breath was coming in sharp gasps. He knew he wouldn't last much longer if they didn't find shelter soon. Zara, however, seemed to have no trouble at all, her alien body clearly built for these conditions. They reached a small structure on the edge of the outpost, a building that looked almost like a small storage shed. Zara pushed the door open with ease, the wood creaking as it gave way to the storm's fury. Mark followed her inside, thankful to escape the wind. The inside of the building was dark and cold, but there was a small fire pit in the center. Zara immediately set to work gathering dry wood and kindling from a pile in the corner, starting the fire with practiced movements. Mark, still shivering from the cold, sat down by the fire, trying to warm up as quickly as possible. "Why did you bring me out here?" Mark asked after a few moments, his teeth still chattering. He wasn't sure if he was angry or just confused. He had thought Zara didn't want his help, but now it seemed like she had wanted him out here with her all along. Zara didn't answer immediately. She was focused on the fire, her hands working quickly to get it started. But after a moment, she spoke without looking at him. "Because we can't afford to waste time. The storm is only going to get worse, and if we don't do something now, we'll both freeze to death." Mark nodded slowly. It was hard to argue with that. He knew the storm was dangerous, but he hadn't realized just how quickly it could turn deadly. He had assumed he would be able to handle it on his own, but Zara had been right. He wasn't prepared for the kind of cold that could freeze a person in an instant. Zara finally turned to look at him, her eyes softening just a little. "I didn't want you to think I needed your help," she said quietly, her voice softer than before. "But I do. We're both in this together now, and if we're going to survive, we need to work together." Mark met her gaze, surprised by the change in her tone. There was something vulnerable in her eyes now, something he hadn't seen before. She was still guarded, but the walls were starting to crack. He didn't know what had caused this shift, but he could tell that it was important. "I understand," Mark said, his voice low. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll get through this together." Zara nodded, and for the first time since they had met, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time, Mark felt like, maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely alone in this. The fire crackled and popped, and the warmth slowly spread through the room, easing the tension in Mark's muscles. Zara didn't say anything more, but she seemed content for the moment, focused on the task of keeping the fire going. Mark watched her, feeling a strange sense of connection. It wasn't just the storm that had brought them together. It was something more. Something he couldn't quite explain, but he knew it was there. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small shelter, the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship between them was enough to keep the cold at bay. For now, the storm continued to howl outside, but inside the small shelter, the warmth of the fire kept the cold at bay. Zara and Mark sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. Mark had thought the storm might pass soon, but it didn't seem like that was going to happen. The wind picked up and the snow outside thickened, obscuring everything from view. Mark glanced over at Zara, who was sitting across from him, her face illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. She hadn't spoken much since they came into the shelter, and Mark had noticed that she seemed more distant than before. There was something about her that still puzzled him, something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was like she was fighting a battle inside her mind, one she wasn't willing to share. Finally, Zara broke the silence. "I never wanted to be here, you know." Mark looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Zara looked into the fire, her expression unreadable. "I didn't ask for this exile. I didn't deserve it. They made me the enemy, turned everyone against me. I was supposed to be one of them." Mark didn't know what to say. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, and the way she said, "one of them," made it clear that she once held a place of power. There was a story there, a painful one that she hadn't shared with him yet. And Mark was starting to realize that her anger wasn't just about the exile. It went deeper than that. "Who made you the enemy?" Mark asked carefully, trying not to push too hard. Zara's eyes flickered toward him, but she didn't meet his gaze. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice flat. What matters is that I'm here, alone, on a planet that no one cares about. I was forced to leave everything behind. My people, my status, my life. Mark could hear the pain in her words, even though she was trying to keep it hidden. He didn't know what to say, but he felt a strong urge to comfort her. Despite the tough exterior, he knew there was a lot more to Zara than she let on. You don't have to be alone, Mark said quietly. I'm here. We're in this together. Zara turned her head sharply, her eyes narrowing. You don't understand, she snapped. You can leave any time you want. You'll go back to your comfortable life, but I'll still be here. I'll always be here, trapped in this cold, lonely world. Mark's heart ached for her. He didn't know what she had gone through, but it was clear that her past haunted her. Her words, though harsh, were full of the kind of sorrow that only came from a deep loss. I'm not going anywhere, Mark said, his voice firm. I came here to help, and I'm not leaving until this mission is over. Zara's eyes softened, just for a moment, before she turned her gaze back to the fire. She didn't respond to his words, but Mark could tell she was thinking about them. She had built up so many walls around herself, and the storm had been relentless. Mark hadn't seen daylight for what felt like days, and the wind outside was so loud that it sounded like a wild animal prowling just outside the walls of their shelter. Despite the warmth of the fire, the cabin seemed to be slowly losing its battle with the cold. Mark had become used to the constant chill in the air, his body adjusting to the freezing temperatures that would have paralyzed anyone else. But even as his body adjusted, his mind was struggling to catch up. Zara had been unusually quiet. She spent most of her time in front of the fire, her gaze distant and lost, as if she were somewhere far away. Mark couldn't help but wonder if she was thinking about her past, the betrayal that had led to her exile, or the people she had lost. He could feel her struggle, but he didn't know how to help. It seemed that Zara had built up walls so high around herself that no one could get in. Mark, too, found himself thinking about his own life. His mission had seemed so simple at first, just a routine check on an outpost, a report to file, and then back home. But now, everything had changed. His life was no longer about following orders or completing a mission. It had become something much more complicated, something much more personal. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Zara finally spoke. Her voice was low, almost lost in the crackling of the fire. Why are you still here? She asked, her eyes still fixed on the flames. You could leave. You could go back to your planet, your people, and forget about me. You're not trapped here like I am. Mark didn't have to think long before answering. I'm here because I don't believe it's too late for you. I think there's still a way out of this. All of this. Zara's gaze flickered toward him, but she didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she looked down at her hands, which were resting in her lap. You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to lose everything, to be cast aside, as if you never mattered. There's no way out of that. Mark shifted in his seat, his legs stiff from sitting too long. I understand more than you think, he said, his voice calm but firm. I've lost things too. Maybe not the same things you've lost, but I know what it's like to feel like there's no way forward. Zara didn't say anything at first. She just continued to stare at the fire, her face expressionless. Mark could see the conflict in her, the deep-rooted pain she was trying so hard to hide. He wasn't sure what had happened in her past, but he could tell that whatever it was, it still held her captive. I don't know how to let go, Zara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to stop holding on to what I lost. Every time I try, it's like I'm drowning. Mark felt a pang of sympathy. He knew what it was like to be stuck in the past, to feel like it was impossible to move on. He had never been exiled, but he had lost people in his life, people he cared about. The pain of those losses still haunted him. You don't have to let go all at once, Mark said gently. You can take small steps. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It just means you're still alive, still fighting. Zara's eyes met his then, and for the first time she didn't look away. Her gaze was piercing, intense, and Mark could feel the weight of her words before she even spoke them. "I don't know if I can fight anymore," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "I'm tired, Mark. I'm tired of fighting a battle I can't win." Mark didn't know how to respond to that. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't too late, that there was still a chance for her, but he could see that she wasn't ready to hear it yet. The pain in her eyes was too deep, too real. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on hers, the warmth of his touch contrasting with the cold of the room. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. "I'll help you fight. If you want to, we'll do this together." Zara's gaze softened for a moment, and Mark saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before. It was like she was allowing herself to hope, just for a moment. But then, as quickly as it came, the look was gone, replaced by the same guarded expression she had worn for so long. "You're crazy, you know that?" Zara said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'm not someone you can save, human." Mark smiled back, though it was small and uncertain. "Maybe I'm not trying to save you, maybe I'm just trying to be here for you. You don't have to do this alone." Zara's smile faded and she pulled her hand away, standing up abruptly. "Enough with the words, you talk too much, human," she said, though her voice lacked the sharpness it had held before. There was no anger in her tone, just a quiet resignation. Mark sat there for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had reached out to her, offered her something, but he could see that she wasn't ready to accept it. And that was okay. He knew that. She had to come to terms with her past in her own time, in her own way. Zara walked toward the small stove and added more wood to the fire. The flames danced higher, casting flickering shadows around the cabin. Mark watched her, his thoughts racing. He knew that the storm outside would eventually pass, but he didn't know how long it would take for Zara to find her way out of the darkness that had held her for so long. "I don't know if I can do this," Zara said quietly, as she stared into the flames. "I don't know if I can move on." Mark stood up slowly, his legs still stiff from sitting too long. "You don't have to do it alone. You're not alone, Zara, not anymore." She didn't respond, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. It was a small shift, but it was something. Mark knew that she wasn't ready to trust him fully yet, but he also knew that trust took time. The storm raged on outside, but inside the shelter, Mark and Zara were no longer just two strangers caught in a survival situation. They were something more, something that neither of them fully understood, but something that had begun to form between them. Slowly but surely, Mark looked out the small window, seeing only swirling white as the storm intensified. It wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. And for the first time since he had arrived on this frozen planet, Mark felt like he wasn't just here for a mission. He was here for something bigger, for Zara, for them both. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. They would face it together. The storm had not let up in days. The wind still howled outside, shaking the walls of the shelter as if trying to tear it apart. Snow piled up against the door, and the world outside had become a frozen, white wasteland. Mark had stopped counting the hours. It felt like they had been trapped in this shelter forever. Zara, however, seemed unaffected by the passage of time. She was as composed as ever, though her eyes had lost their usual sharpness. She was still distant, still holding on to the past. But Mark could see the smallest cracks in her armor. She was slowly allowing herself to trust him. Little by little, Mark had spent most of his days by the fire, adding wood, trying to keep the warmth alive in the cabin. Zara had been quieter than usual, retreating into herself as if she were battling some unseen war in her mind. He didn't push her to talk. She wasn't ready for that, but he was here, and for now, that was enough. It was on the fourth morning of the storm that things changed. Mark had been sleeping fitfully when he was suddenly woken by a loud banging sound on the door. He shot up, his heart racing. His first instinct was to run and check the door, but when he saw Zara standing, her eyes wide with alarm, he knew something was wrong. "Get ready," Zara said quickly, her voice sharper than usual. "There's something outside." Mark jumped, out of bed, scrambling to his feet. What is it? What's going on? Zara moved swiftly across the cabin, grabbing her coat and pulling it on. She looked at him with urgency in her eyes. I don't know what it is, but we can't stay here. The storm has drawn them in. Mark's stomach sank. The storm had kept them isolated. And yet, in the midst of it, someone, had found them. He didn't ask any more questions. He grabbed his coat and followed Zara to the door. As they stepped outside into the snow, the wind almost knocked them off their feet. The world was a blur of white, and Mark could barely see past the storm. But he could hear the sounds of movement, the crunch of footsteps in the snow, the soft rustle of something large approaching. Zara led the way, her movements sure and quick, like she knew exactly where she was going. Mark struggled to keep up, his feet sinking deep into the snow with each step. The cold cut through his layers of clothing, biting into his skin, but there was no time to focus on that. They had to move. We have to reach the supply cache, Zara shouted over the wind. It's not far. Mark nodded, his breath visible in the frigid air. He had no idea what was out there, but the urgency in Zara's voice made him realize that whatever it wasn't good. They pushed forward, moving as fast as they could. The storm was relentless, but Zara seemed unfazed. She kept her focus ahead, leading Mark through the snow with ease. Mark, however, was struggling. The cold was starting to get to him, and he could feel his legs growing weaker. He had no idea how much longer they could keep this up. But then, through the snow, Mark saw it. The silhouette of something large moving toward them through the storm. At first he thought it might be a trick of the light, but as they got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a group of alien creatures, their forms hulking and monstrous, moving with purpose through the snow. Mark's heart raced. He had heard rumors about these creatures, dangerous predatory beings that roamed the outer worlds, but he hadn't expected